Hi everybody, welcome to our next video from the Wisconsin First Detector Network. Today we have Jake Walsh, who is a postdoctoral researcher at the Center for Limnology at UW-Madison, and he'll be talking about invasive spiny water flea here in Madison in Lake Mendota.
Great, thanks for tuning in and thanks for listening. Thanks for having me here. And so today I wanted to talk a little bit about my doctoral research, which I also did at the Center for Limnology. And so my focus was on thinking about the ecological and economic impacts of spiny water flea in Lake Mendota. And so I think a lot of the things we found really point to the importance of networks like the Wisconsin First Detectors networks, which play a major role in preventing invasions or slowing the spread of invasions. And I think these ecological and economic impacts really highlight that, the importance of that. So I'll start with a little bit of background, thinking about the economic implications of invasive species, but also the ecosystem services that ecosystems like lakes provide. And then I'll get into specifically the story of spiny water flea in Lake Mendota and thinking about its ecological and economic impacts on the lake and on the people who live around the lake. So when we think of invasive species and their impacts at the global scale, or even maybe the impacts in your own backyard or your favorite walking trail or something like that, we think about how invasive species change how ecosystems function and how ecosystems work. And then we also think about how invasive species can drive extinctions in these ecosystems. They're a leading driver of extinctions globally, and we're losing species at an alarming rate, and invasive species are a big part of that. And what we tend to think less about, particularly in the aquatic world, is how invasive species affect us, how they affect our economy and our well-being. And so thinking about this in terms of not only their ecological impacts, but how those ecological impacts feed back and affect our lives and affect how we enjoy the ecosystems that we care about. So before we get into any of that, I think one really important concept to understand is this concept of ecosystem services. And so ecosystem services are the benefits that humans derive from nature, and we get these largely for free. And they can come in a lot of different shapes and forms, but in aquatic systems, you can think of them in terms of the things that provide social and economic value. These are the things that you love about the lakes that you visit or the lakes that you live by. In Lake Tahoe, this could be something like clear water for recreation. These kayakers are probably enjoying this lake quite a bit more because it's crystal clear and you can see through to the bottom than if it were murky and scummy with algae. But you can also think about the ecosystem services in a much more practical sense. And this could be the fisheries provided by either of these lakes, providing food and protein for people in the region. Or in the terms of Lake Mead, you can think about lakes in terms of the hydroelectric power they provide and the drinking water they provide for millions of people. So lakes can be really valuable, and they are really valuable because of these ecosystem services. And when we think about ecosystem services globally, we start to see just how much we rely on them as a species or as humanity. There has been some studies that have tried to estimate how much these ecosystem services are valued globally. And what they find is that these numbers are just astronomical. This particular study found that ecosystem services are valued globally at something like $100 trillion per year. And this is much greater than our global GDP. And so that really reflects how much we depend on these services that we get pretty much for free, or for how much we're willing to invest in extracting them. However, we're losing these services at a rate of something between $4 and $20 trillion per year. And of course, invasive species are a big part of why we're losing these ecosystem services, because they impact native species and native ecosystems, and that in turn impacts the ecosystem services that we enjoy from these ecosystems, or in this case, lakes. So when we think about invasive species in the context of ecosystem services, when we invest in the prevention, control, and eradication of invasive species, we're protecting ecosystem services and we're protecting real economic value. So when these sort of on-the-ground efforts to prevent invasions are investing in preventing invasions, like the Wisconsin First Detectors Network, we're protecting real value and things that really matter to us about these ecosystems that we enjoy. So that brings us to Spiny water flea and the story of Spiny water flea here in Lake Mendota. So some background on Lake Mendota. Many of you are familiar with the lake. It forms the north shore of the Madison Isthmus, and it's a really important lake to Madison and to Dane County and to the state of Wisconsin. Lake Mendota is also eutrophic, which means it's productive with algae and a lot of plant growth. And this is because there are a lot of nutrients in the lake, fertilizing that algae and that plant growth. And the reason Lake Mendota has so many nutrients in it is because it's in this highly agricultural watershed. Agriculture is foundational to Wisconsin and to how our economy functions. And so our lakes in this agricultural landscape receive a lot of nutrients from agricultural practices in the watershed. And so agriculture in particular contributes the vast majority of the nutrients to Lake Mendota. The manure that we're applying to farm fields or the manure that comes directly from cows is washed into our streams and into our lakes with rain, and that can fertilize algae and plant growth in the lake and lead to Lake Mendota being more eutrophic, and ultimately lead to these nuisance scum-forming algae blooms that can actually be harmful in some cases. They close beaches, and they affect how we enjoy Lake Mendota. We certainly wouldn't want to fish in a scum like this one by the dock. We wouldn't want to swim in that or boat by it. Even walking by that can be kind of a smelly, unpleasant experience. And so agriculture and eutrophication play this big role in how we enjoy Lake Mendota. And that sets the backdrop for spiny water flea and its impacts in the lake. So spiny water flea is an invasive predatory zooplankton. Zooplankton are tiny animals that live in lakes or live in the ocean. And they play really important roles in lake food webs. Even though they're small, they can have really big effects on how lakes work. Spiny water flea is native to Eurasia, that Europe, Asia, Russia region where we tend to get a lot of our aquatic invasive species here in the Midwest. And it invaded Lake Mendota, or it was discovered in Lake Mendota in 2009. And when we discovered it, it was extremely abundant at these high densities that we haven't seen anywhere else, basically in the world. And so for us, that's a problem because spiny water flea preys selectively on this native zooplankton known as Daphnia, and that's what's pictured here on the right. And I often think of Daphnia as the unsung heroes of water quality in Lake Mendota. And I think of them that way because they maintain clear water in the lake by grazing down algae growing in the lake. And so in Lake Mendota in particular, we have so many Daphnia that they can actually help us offset the negative effects of agriculture and nutrients on algae growth. They can sort of graze down the algae and give us clearer water as a result. And so they're an incredibly valuable species in the lake that provides this incredibly valuable ecosystem service to those of us who enjoy Lake Mendota. And so when I think about the impacts of spiny water flea, I think it's useful to think of them in terms of a socio-ecological system. So we have not only those parts of the lake that we think of as ecological, the animals and plants and nutrients in the lake, but also the human element of that system, or the socioeconomic element of that system, where the things that are happening in the lake feed back to us and how we enjoy Lake Mendota. And so when we think of spiny water flea, we can think about it both in terms of its ecological impact on the organisms in the lake, but also in terms of its economic impact, in terms of how we enjoy the lake and how the lake provides ecosystem services to us. So first I'll start with that ecological impact, because that sets the stage for how it impacts us. So we're going to think about what was lost ecologically in the lake. We estimate that we lost something like 60% of our Daphnia. So spiny water flea increased the total predation on Daphnia by a huge amount, and it led to this 60% decline in the total amount of Daphnia in the lake. So Daphnia aren't gone, but their populations are reduced by quite a bit. And this led to an overall decline in water clarity in the lake. We don't have as many Daphnia grazing down algae, which means the lake is a little bit murkier, something like 3 feet of visibility we lost on average. So it's murkier with algae, fewer Daphnia, and that's going to impact how we enjoy the lake. Clarity is a really important is a really important ecosystem service in Lake Mendota. And so taking that 3 feet of clarity that we lost, we can think more about what that means for us and what that means for ecosystem services. So there was a study done in 2001 that asked citizens in Dane County, how much would you be willing to pay for improved water quality in Lake Mendota? And that improvement would correspond to gaining roughly 3 feet of clarity. So we're losing it here with invasive spiny water flea. We'd be gaining it in this survey, but either way, we're talking about 3 feet of clarity. So we can get at the value of that 3 feet of clarity through this willingness to pay survey. What they found is that citizens or households would be willing to pay, on average, $350 for improved water quality in Lake Mendota. And this is on average across Dane County. And so what I did is I scaled that number up to the present day value to account for inflation. And then I scaled that across the whole county, because Dane County has been growing since this study was done in 2001. So we have a few more households. And when you do that, you see just this extreme value of water clarity in the lake, something like $140 million to the county. And of course, this is a ballpark estimate. It's not an exact number. It just reflects the extreme value of clear water in Lake Mendota to the citizens who use it. So for me, I see a number like that and value lost like that, and I have to think about, well, how do we fix that? How do we bring that clarity back and get to enjoying Lake Mendota like we used to before spiny water flea showed up? And one really major challenge with that question is that we don't know how to control or eradicate spiny water flea, or at least we haven't invested in researching control or eradication methods for spiny water flea. But we can sort of turn the problem on its end and think about turning other dials in the lake to offset spiny water flea's impact on water clarity. In particular, we can reduce the amount of nutrients or phosphorus that gets into the lake. And you remember that was largely from agriculture. So if we sort of turn down the dial of that nutrient load into the lake from agriculture, we could offset spiny water flea's impact on water clarity through predation on Daphnia. And so I put together a model using long-term monitoring data from Lake Mendota. We have really great long-term data. And I found that to offset spiny water flea's impact on clarity, we would have to reduce something like 71% of the nutrient load into Lake Mendota, which is just a massive number. To put it in context, we, over the decades of trying to reduce nutrient loading into the lake, haven't had a measurable effect on that nutrient load. In a lot of ways, that's a good thing. The nutrient load hasn't increased, even though we have more cows and we have more agriculture in the watershed. But in the context of a 71% reduction, it really puts that in perspective of how hard it is to reduce the load. And to reduce the load as much as a 71% reduction is a really major challenge. And this is reflected in how much that project would cost. And so I put together an estimate using this Yahara Clean engineering report, where they collated the best management practices that could lead to nutrient load reduction into Lake Mendota. And so I found the practices that would get us to a 71% reduction and how much they would cost. Okay. So when we take that all together, we're talking about an extremely valuable ecosystem service in water clarity that's worth a lot to Dane County. And we're talking about costs to bring that clarity back that are equally as expensive, which highlights a couple things. One, it highlights how valuable water clarity is to how we enjoy the lake. It affects everything from swimming to fishing to walking along the shore. But it also suggests that it might be worth redoubling our efforts to reduce the nutrient load into Lake Mendota to bring that clarity back. We might not ever be able to manage spiny water flea, but we can get that clarity back through reducing the nutrient load into the lake, and this suggests it might be worth it. One other really important point that this points to is that this is one invasive species in one lake affecting one ecosystem service. In reality, we have dozens of aquatic invasive species. Of course, not all of them are impactful, but many of them are, that are across tens of thousands of lakes in the Midwest. And each of those lakes provides a handful of services that matter a lot to the people who enjoy the lake. And so if you scale this up, it highlights just how damaging invasive species can be, but also how valuable it is to prevent invasions and to slow invasions in the Midwest and in Wisconsin. So coming back to this main point, When we invest in preventing, controlling, and eradicating invasive species, we're protecting ecosystem services. And this means we're protecting real economic value and real things that are valuable to us that use the lake. And so at a broader scale, so thinking about tens of thousands of lakes, dozens of invasive species, and a handful of services, invasive species damages really highlight that value of preventing invasions, making sure they stay put either in their native range or in a small number of lakes here in their invaded ranges. And this also suggests that while researching and implementing control or eradication methods can be expensive, often so expensive that we think of them as prohibitive or something that's not worth investing in, these expenses might actually be small relative to the value of the services we're protecting. In the case of Lake Mendota, Spiny water flea essentially wrote us a $140 million check to think about how could we control or eradicate its populations or prevent it from spreading into similarly valuable lakes that provide similarly valuable services. So while we think about control and eradication is often really hard to do, this might suggest that it's worth investing a little bit more in thinking about solutions for invasive species. And finally, this points to thinking about lakes and invasive species in the context of socio-ecological systems. So not just thinking about their ecological impacts, but also thinking about how they impact ecosystem services and impact us and our economy and our well-being. So that's all I got for today. Thank you for listening, and please feel free to contact me with questions.
Thanks a lot, Jake. I think that was a really interesting talk. Getting at the economic impact of these species is just something we don't think about a lot, and clearly it's a big impact that we should be thinking about. So obviously we've learned that spiny water flea is present in high numbers in Lake Mendota. Do you have a sense of where else it is within Wisconsin and whether it's continuing to spread to new lakes?
Yeah, so spiny water flea, it has been spreading. We know that it's in roughly a dozen lakes in Wisconsin. These tend to be in northern Wisconsin. Spiny water flea is a cool water species. It likes cooler lakes, and it tends to get pretty warm down here in southern Wisconsin. And actually, Lake Mendota is like the very southern edge of its range. And so it hasn't spread as much down here. It's in each of our chain lakes here in Madison, so Mendota, Monona, Wabeesa, Costanza, but we haven't seen it in any other lakes in southern Wisconsin. Where it is spreading is in northern Wisconsin, sort of along the southern shore of Lake Superior.
My understanding is that our northern lakes tend to not have the same eutrophic characteristics as we do in our more southern lakes, and particularly in Madison. Or I guess, what are the impacts of spiny water flea in those different lake systems?
I think that's a really great question. We don't have the same agricultural issues and challenges in northern Wisconsin as we do in southern Wisconsin. And so I don't think we see the impact of spiny water flea on water clarity play out in the same way in northern Wisconsin. What it does do is, in these lakes that tend to be a little less productive, they prey on the same zooplankton species that small fish tend to prey on. And so we think of them as sort of reducing the prey base for small fish, which of course either turn into large fish or feed larger fish that we like to fish for. And so it can reduce this prey base, but it's not a great prey item itself. It has that really long tail spine. Small fish have a really hard time with that. They can't get their mouths around it. And so it can lead to sort of these negative impacts on fisheries.
You just mentioned the tail spine on spiny water flea, which I'm guessing is a diagnostic characteristic of this species. If somebody's out fishing or recreating in their lake, how would they know if they've discovered spiny water flea?
Fortunately for detection and for identifying it, there's no zooplankton in Wisconsin that look quite like spiny water flea. Nothing has that tail spine. And so that tail spine is roughly a half an inch long. And you most often find it, or people most often find it, when spiny water flea has sort of gripped onto and clumped on their fishing lines. And so they'll clump onto fishing lines in pretty high numbers, like a dozen or so, and they'll clog your reel as you're reeling in. And that's often how we find them, is by them gripping onto fishing lines. And they'll look like a bunch of tiny little spikes coming off your line. And you'll look closer and you'll see spiny water flea. They're not microscopic by any means. You can see them. They're small, but you can see them. And yeah, luckily there's nothing that looks quite like them. So those tail spines are really, really good for identifying.
So coming from a terrestrial invasive species background, sometimes when we're considering how we can manage terrestrial invasive species, we think about trying to restore native species that might outcompete the invasives and give them kind of less space to work with. So thinking about how spiny water flea are preying on Daphnia, is there anything that we could do to increase the Daphnia population, or anything that we can do to kind of crowd out the spiny water flea?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question. It's a lot of what we're thinking about right now is how can we use sort of the lake food web to control spiny water flea. And so there aren't a lot of species that compete with spiny water flea, but we do know a lot of our fish eat spiny water flea. They can get to a certain size where the spine isn't as big of a deal, and they can eat spiny water flea. And actually here in Madison, we have a really cool sort of study system where we have a ton of spiny water flea in Lake Mendota, but not very many in Lake Mendota. Like they're there, but they're at much lower densities. And we think one of the reasons that might be is because Lake Mendota has a very different fish community than Lake Mendota does. Monona tends to have more sort of smaller zooplankton eating fish than Mendota. And particularly have a lot of bluegill. And there's sort of this fun pet theory in the literature where bluegill can actually manipulate spiny water flea to snap off their tail spines and swallow them that way. And so that means that they can eat spiny water flea basically twice as fast as any other fish. And so we're looking into how are native fishes eating spiny water flea? Could that explain why there are fewer spiny water flea in Lake Monona than in Lake Mendota? And could we use fish to actually control spiny water flea? Of course, fish also eat Daphnia, and so we have to think about that trade-off as well. But I think it's a really exciting direction that we're in the middle of right now.
Yeah, it sounds like there's a lot of really interesting research coming out of this, for sure. Well, thanks again to Jake for joining us. And if you have any questions about spiny water flea or about the research that Jake has done, you can find his contact information on your screen and feel free to get in touch with him. Thanks for watching this video from the Wisconsin First Detector Network. To learn more about our network or to access additional information about invasive species in Wisconsin, please visit our website or contact us.